They called her a ghost, a glitch in the system, a civilian analyst who did not belong. They watched her trace the lines of mountains on a screen and saw a woman lost in daydreams. The commander, a man forged in the simple crucible of battlefield command, saw only weakness and dared to challenge her. He would learn that some ghosts were not memories of the dead, but premonitions of ruin for those who stood against them. He would learn that when she spoke, it was not to offer opinions, but to state the inevitable. And when the mountain itself began to scream and the digital world collapsed into shrieking static, he would learn that his authority was a hollow thing, and her knowledge was the only bedrock left. He would be broken not by the enemy, but by the quiet woman he had tried to erase, the one they would later call Red Venom. The silence in Deepwatch Station Kestrel was not an absence of noise. It was a manufactured, pressurized thing, a composite of humming life support, the whisper of climate control through filtered vents, and the low, thrumming resonance of the mountain itself. The station was a technological marvel buried 3,000 feet beneath the granite peak of Mount Tantalus, a nerve center of the Allied coalition's northern defense grid. Its walls were a layered composite of titanium, reinforced concrete, and seismic gel dampeners, designed to withstand a direct tactical nuclear strike. Yet the silence felt fragile, like a sheet of ice stretched over a deep, cold ocean. Alara felt it in her bones, a low-frequency vibration that was not on any of her sensors. It was the vibration of 24 souls living in a cage of their own making, breathing recycled air and staring at screens that showed them a world they could no longer touch. Her own station was an anomaly within the crisp, martial order of the command center. While the other consoles were arranged in neat, hierarchical rows facing the main strategic display, hers was tucked into an alcove set apart. It was a custom rig, a nest of servers and specialized interfaces that she had assembled herself. 3 primary monitors displayed a flowing river of data that would have been meaningless to anyone else in the room. One showed a spectrographic analysis of the local lithosphere, a vibrant, shifting tapestry of reds, blues, and greens that represented the seismic heartbeat of the Tantalus Massif. The second was a complex network topology map, visualizing data flow not as lines and boxes, but as a fluid dynamic system, with eddies and currents representing bandwidth and latency. The third, and most important, was a raw data feed, a cascade of hexadecimal code scrolling at a speed that defied conscious reading. She did not read it. She absorbed it, letting the pattern seep into her, a form of digital osmosis. Her fingers, long and pale, moved with quiet economy across a worn keyboard. She was cataloging microfractures in the F7 stratum, a layer of quartz-rich granite 200 meters below the station's foundation. For 3 weeks, she had been building a predictive model of the mountain's stress architecture. It was a slow, methodical process, like learning a language spoken only by stone and gravity. She correlated the seismic data with atmospheric pressure changes, tidal forces, even the minute gravitational pull of passing satellites. To the Marines who walked past her alcove, she was the quiet geologist, the weird civilian contractor whose purpose was a mystery filed away in some high-level clearance folder they would never see. They saw her slight frame, the dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional knot, the gray jumpsuit that bore no rank or insignia. They saw nothing of consequence. That was a miscalculation. Her official designation was subsurface analyst, a title as deliberately bland as her jumpsuit. It was a lie of omission. Her real work was in the intersection of geology and signal intelligence, a field so new it barely had a name. She studied how physical vibrations propagated through solid matter and how those same principles could be applied to digital networks. To her, a seismic shockwave and a denial of service attack were merely different expressions of the same fundamental physics, a targeted application of energy designed to overwhelm a system's capacity for cohesion. The mountain and the network were one interconnected entity, and she was learning to read its soul. Specialist. The voice was a blunt instrument, designed to command attention through sheer volume and abrasive certainty. It shattered the delicate focus of her work. Alara did not look up immediately. She finished typing a line of code, marking a newly identified shear plane for further analysis. Only then did she let her eyes lift from the screen. Commander Valerius stood before her alcove, his posture a study in rigid military bearing. He was a large man, his uniform immaculate, the crisp lines of his Marine Corps dress blues a stark contrast to her own functional attire. His jaw was set, his gaze a mixture of impatience and open disdain. Behind him, two junior officers shifted uncomfortably, caught in the blast radius of their commander's personality. "My designation is Alara," she stated, her voice flat and devoid of inflection. She did not use his title. In her experience, men who were overly fond of their rank were often using it to compensate for a deficiency elsewhere. Valerius's eyes narrowed. It was a small, almost imperceptible tightening, but to Alara, who read micro-expressions the way she read seismic data, it was a flare of ego-driven anger. He had expected deference, perhaps a flustered apology for her perceived slowness. He had received a factual correction. "Your designation is whatever I say it is, civilian," he grated, leaning forward and placing his hands on the edge of her console. It was an invasion of her space, a physical assertion of dominance. He gestured vaguely at her screens. "I have reviewed your progress reports, or rather, the lack thereof. For 3 weeks, you have been down here, taking up valuable space and resources. To do what? Look at pretty pictures of rocks? My Marines are on 12-hour watch cycles, securing our perimeter against a tangible enemy, and you are mapping pebbles." The two junior officers behind him suppressed smirks. The insult was public, designed to humiliate, to put the civilian outsider in her place. Alara's gaze drifted from his face to his hands, resting heavy on her console. She noted the slight tremor in his right index finger, the way his knuckles were white. He was not as calm as his posture suggested. He was insecure. His authority in this subterranean world was absolute in theory, but the nature of the threat they faced was shifting beyond the scope of his training. The enemy, a highly sophisticated insurgent group known as the Phalanx, had not engaged in a single conventional assault. Their attacks were surgical, aimed at data links and remote sensor arrays. They were fighting a war of ghosts and shadows, and Valerius, a man of frontal assaults and overwhelming force, was a hammer in a world that now required a scalpel. He felt his irrelevance growing like a mold in the damp, recycled air, and he was lashing out at the nearest, softest target. She looked back up at him, her expression unreadable. "The pebbles, Commander, constitute the foundation upon which this $3 billion facility rests. The pretty pictures are a real-time structural integrity model. My work is to understand the medium through which our enemy might choose to attack, a medium you are currently ignoring." Her response was calm, clinical. She presented facts, not arguments. It was like explaining gravity to a man who had just tripped. Valerius's face flushed a dull, angry red. He had expected fear, or at least submission. He had not expected a lecture. "The enemy is on the surface, a specialist. They attack our comms towers and our supply lines. They are not moles. This is a fortress. Your work is a waste of time. I am giving you one more week. Deliver a tangible, actionable intelligence product, something my Marines can use, or I will have you reassigned. You will be cataloging ration inventory in the supply depot. Am I understood?" The threat was crude, a bureaucratic cudgel. "Perfectly," Alara said. The single word was a masterpiece of dismissal. It was not agreement. It was an acknowledgement that she had heard his noise, processed its content, and filed it away as irrelevant data. She turned her gaze back to her monitors, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The gesture was clear. The conversation was over. For a moment, Valerius stood frozen, his jaw working silently. He had been rendered obsolete in his own command center. He had brought the full force of his rank and personality to bear on this quiet, unassuming woman, and it had slid off her like water off polished stone. He was a storm, and she was the mountain. With a guttural sound of frustration, he spun on his heel and stalked away, his junior officers trailing in his wake like pilot fish. Alara watched his reflection disappear from her screen. She cataloged his behavior: threat posture, high; logical reasoning, low; emotional volatility, critical. He was a variable she would have to account for. A system under stress, prone to unpredictable failure. She sighed, a barely audible exhalation of air, and returned to her work. The mountain was speaking to her, whispering secrets of pressure and time. It was a far more interesting conversation. In the corner of her main display, a new microfracture bloomed, a tiny, spiderweb-thin line in the deep rock. It was anomalous. It was not following the predicted stress patterns. It was too regular, too geometric. Her focus narrowed. The background noise of the command center faded away. Something was wrong. The next 4 days passed in a state of heightened, almost feverish concentration for Alara. She slept in 4-hour increments on a cot she had set up in her alcove, subsisting on nutrient paste and recycled water. The anomaly she had detected was not an isolated event. It was the first of a pattern. Dozens, then hundreds of similar microfractures were appearing across the F7 stratum, forming a lattice-like structure that was utterly alien to natural geological processes. It was precise, deliberate, and expanding. She ran simulations, cross-referencing the patterns with every known geological phenomenon. Nothing matched. It was not tectonic stress, not hydrostatic pressure, not magmatic intrusion. It was artificial. She tried to explain her findings to Lieutenant Eva Rostova, the station's signals intelligence chief. Rostova was sharp, her mind accustomed to finding patterns in chaos. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed as Alara walked her through the seismic data. "So, you're saying something is drawing on the rock?" Rostova asked, her skepticism clear but not dismissive. "Like a laser, but underground?" "Not drawing, resonating," Alara corrected, pointing to a waveform analysis on her screen. "Look here, these are not impact signatures. They are sympathetic vibrations. Something is broadcasting a specific ultra-low frequency into the mountain. It's tuned to the crystalline structure of the F7 quartz. It's not breaking the rock. It's shaking it apart at a molecular level, creating these perfectly structured fractures. It's like a singer shattering a glass, but the glass is a mile of solid granite, and the song is taking days to sing." Rostova stared at the screen, her technical expertise allowing her to grasp the terrifying implications. "A geological weapon," she whispered, her face paling. "But the energy required, it would be astronomical. We would have detected the power source." "Not if the source is diffuse," Alara countered. "Not if they are using a distributed network of small, low-power emitters buried over miles of terrain, all synchronized to pulse at the exact same microsecond. The cumulative effect would be immense, but each individual source would be statistically indistinguishable from background seismic noise." "It's brilliant, and it's a death sentence for this station," she traced the expanding lattice on the screen. "They are building a failure plane. Once the lattice is complete, they can trigger a controlled, cascading collapse. They won't need to blow the mountain up. They'll just let it fall in on itself." Rostova felt a cold dread seep into her. She had seen the phalanxes work on the network. Their elegant, almost artistic hacks that dismantled firewalls and encryption with terrifying efficiency. This was the same philosophy applied to the physical world. It was not brute force. It was a deep, patient, and horrifyingly intelligent understanding of the system they were attacking. "You have to show this to the commander," Rostova said, her voice urgent. Ilara's expression remained impassive. "The commander processes information that fits his worldview. Data that contradicts it is discarded as error. He believes the threat is on the surface. He will not listen." "You have to make him listen," Rostova insisted. "This is the whole station, Ilara. All of us." Against her better judgment, Ilara agreed. She compiled her data into a concise, 3-page report, complete with predictive models and threat assessments. She stripped it of all jargon she could, simplifying the complex geophysics into stark, direct warnings. She attached a recommendation: an immediate deep-range seismic scan of the surrounding 20 square miles to locate the emitters. Rostova arranged the meeting. It was a disaster. Valerius held the report as if it were a piece of contaminated garbage. He scanned the first page, his lip curling in a sneer. He did not read the other two. He tossed it onto the polished surface of the briefing room table. "Emitters in the ground?" he scoffed, his voice booming in the confined space. "Resonating rocks? Specialist. This is the most absurd piece of science fiction I have ever had the misfortune of reading. You are seeing ghosts in your machines. My patrols have swept every inch of the surface. There is nothing out there." "They would be buried, Commander," Ilara stated calmly. "And they would be small. You are looking for tanks. You should be looking for needles in a haystack the size of a mountain range. And I'm supposed to divert critical resources from perimeter defense for this ghost hunt, based on your squiggly lines." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I gave you a week to produce actionable intelligence. Instead, you bring me a fantasy. Your time is up." He turned to Rostova. "Lieutenant, escort this woman to the supply depot. Her new commanding officer is Quartermaster Sergeant Cole. Her duties will be inventory and sanitation, effective immediately." Rostova stood frozen, horrified. "Sir, with respect, her data is sound. The pattern is anomalous. We should at least run a preliminary scan." "Respectfully, Lieutenant," Valerius cut her off, his voice dropping to a dangerously low growl. "You will follow your orders, or you can join her in counting ration packs. Is that clear?" The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Rostova's loyalty to the chain of command, drilled into her since her first day at the academy, warred with her logical assessment of the situation. The commander was wrong. She knew it. But to disobey a direct order in a command situation was unthinkable. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "Yes, Commander," she mumbled. Valerius gave Ilara a final triumphant smirk. He had won. He had reasserted his authority and put the civilian in her place. He had restored order to his world. "Dismissed," he barked. As Rostova led a silent Ilara from the briefing room, a klaxon began to blare. Not the sharp, intermittent alarm for a perimeter breach, but a deep, gut-wrenching, continuous wail that none of them had ever heard before. It was the Cascadian failure alarm. On the main strategic display, a dozen critical systems flashed from green to red in an instant. The lights in the corridor flickered violently, then dimmed to a blood-red emergency glow. A profound low-frequency hum vibrated up through the floor, a sound so deep it was felt more than heard. It was the sound of the mountain screaming. The crisis was not a sudden explosion, but a creeping, inexorable collapse. The hum grew in intensity, a monstrous, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the world. Dust sifted from the ceiling panels. Hairline cracks raced across the reinforced concrete walls like black lightning. On the main display, the network topology map, once a placid blue river, was now a chaotic storm of crimson alerts. Data packets were being lost in the billions. Internal comms dissolved into a shriek of static. The station was being deafened and blinded. Commander Valerius stood at the center of the command deck, bellowing orders that no one could hear over the din. "Damage control teams, report! Get me a systems diagnostic. What is our status?" His voice, usually a tool of absolute command, was now a thin, reedy thing, swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the failing station. His face was a mask of disbelief. This was not an attack. This was an apocalypse. His training had prepared him for firefights, for sieges, for tactical maneuvers. It had not prepared him for the laws of physics to be turned against him. He tried to fall back on protocol. "Seal all blast doors! Isolate the affected sectors!" he yelled. But the control systems were unresponsive. The station's central processing core was in a state of cascading logic failure. The very language of the machine had been turned to gibberish. The enemy had not cut the network. They had poisoned it. The same low-frequency resonance that was shaking the mountain apart was also inducing harmonic vibrations in the delicate crystalline structures of the station's processors. The digital and physical attacks were one and the same. It was exactly as Ilara had predicted. Rostova, her face ashen, fought to maintain control of her own console. Her diagnostic tools were useless, spitting out streams of corrupted data. She saw Valerius, a man she had once respected, now reduced to a frantic, impotent figure, shouting useless commands at a dying machine. His methods, his entire worldview, were failing in real time. Brute force was useless against an enemy you could not see, an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The playbook he had lived by was on fire. Amidst the chaos and rising panic, a single point of stillness existed. Ilara had not gone to the supply depot. When the alarm had sounded, she had simply turned and walked back to her alcove. Rostova, seeing the futility of Valerius's orders, had followed her. Ilara was seated at her console, her expression one of intense, dispassionate focus. Her own system, with its isolated power supply and analog-to-digital converters buffered against harmonic interference, was still partially functional. Her screens were a mess of corrupted signals, but behind the noise, the core data was still flowing. She was watching the lattice of microfractures in the F7 stratum. They were no longer expanding. They were pulsing. A final massive energy spike was being channeled through them. "They've triggered the cascade," she said, her voice a calm island in the roaring sea of noise. "The failure plane is active. The model gives us 12 minutes until the primary support structures begin to shear. After that, total collapse is inevitable." She spoke as if discussing a weather forecast. Rostova stared at her, her mind struggling to process the information. 12 minutes. They had 12 minutes until they were buried alive under 3,000 feet of granite. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ilara's fingers flew across her keyboard, her movements precise and economical. "Standard methods are useless. We cannot stop the resonance, but we might be able to counteract it." She brought up a new schematic on her main screen. It was a diagram of the station's primary power core, a compact fusion reactor that powered the entire facility. Superimposed over it was a schematic of the station's geological survey emitters, the same deep penetration seismic sensors she used for her research. "Commander Valerius's methodology is linear, force against force. It's a fool's game when you are outmatched. The key is not to oppose the energy, but to redirect it. To introduce a counter frequency that will disrupt the harmonic a second before it reaches its destructive peak. We fight a song with another song." The concept was audacious, terrifying. "You want to weaponize the reactor?" Rostova breathed, horrified and fascinated. "And the survey emitters, they're not designed for that kind of power output. You'll vaporize them." "The emitters are expendable," Ilara stated flatly. "We are not. I need you to bypass the reactor's safety protocols, all of them. I need to be able to draw the full, unregulated output of the core for a duration of 3.2 seconds. The request was insane. It was a flagrant violation of every safety protocol ever written. Bypassing the reactor safeties could trigger a core breach, turning the entire mountain into a radioactive crater. But the alternative was certain death in a collapsing tomb. Rostova looked from Ilara's calm, focused face to the panicked, screaming chaos of the command deck. The choice was brutally simple. She could follow the orders of a failing commander to her grave, or she could trust the quiet woman with the impossible plan. "Show me what to do," Rostova said, her voice firm. The moment of decision had passed. Her allegiance had shifted. Authority, real authority, did not come from a rank insignia. It came from competence in a crisis. And in this moment, Ilara was the only competent person in the room. As Rostova began frantically working at a secondary terminal, her fingers flying to execute the dangerous bypass commands, Valerius finally noticed them. He saw one of his officers taking orders from the civilian he had just dismissed. His face, already pale with fear, contorted with rage. It was the final insult, the ultimate breakdown of his authority. He stormed over to the alcove, his heavy boots thudding on the vibrating deck plating. "Lieutenant, what in God's name do you think you are doing?" he roared, his voice cracking with strain. "Step away from that console." "That is a direct order!" He reached out to grab Rostova's arm. Before he could make contact, Ilara moved. She did not stand. She simply swiveled in her chair, her body blocking his path. She looked up at him, and for the first time, there was something other than dispassionate analysis in her eyes. It was a cold, hard, diamond-like clarity. It was the look of a predator that had been disturbed while hunting. "You are relieved of command, Commander," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the din like a laser. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Valerius stared at her, dumbfounded. He laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. Relieved? By you? A civilian? You have no authority here. Alara's lips curved into something that was not a smile. It was a chilling, geometric shape, devoid of all humor. It was the expression of a system achieving a state of perfect, lethal efficiency. My authority is not derived from a commission, Commander. It is derived from the fact that I have a solution and you have nothing but panic. In 9 minutes, this station will cease to exist. You can either stand aside and let me work, or you can die with your regulations in your hand. The choice is yours, but you will not interfere. The sheer, unadulterated certainty in her voice stunned him into silence. Other Marines on the deck, those who were close enough to hear, had stopped their panicked scurrying. They were watching, their faces a mixture of fear and dawning hope. They saw their commander, loud and useless, and they saw the quiet woman who spoke of solutions. The invisible mantle of command was lifting from Valerius's shoulders and settling, unbidden, onto hers. Authority was flowing to her, drawn by the gravity of her competence. Rostova, ignoring Valerius completely, looked at Alara. The safeties are bypassed. The core is hot and unlocked. I've routed primary power conduits to the emitter array controls. It's all yours. Alara gave a single, sharp nod. Thank you, Lieutenant. She turned back to her console. A new window was open, a simple interface of her own design. A countdown timer showed 00814. Below it was a complex waveform display and a single, large red button labeled Pulse. Now, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, we wait for the right moment. We have only one shot at this. The 8 minutes that followed were the longest of anyone's life. The station groaned and shuddered around them, a dying beast. The air grew thick with concrete dust. Valerius stood frozen, a statue of obsolete power, his face a ruin of conflicting emotions. Rage, fear, humiliation, and a dawning, horrified respect. The Marines on the deck did not look at him anymore. They looked at Alara. They watched her watch her screens, her calm a hypnotic anchor in the storm. She was no longer a civilian contractor. She was their only hope. Alara's entire consciousness was focused on the waveform display. It showed the enemy's resonant frequency, a perfect rising sine wave. She was waiting for the precise apex of the final pulse, the moment of maximum energy injection, just before it would trigger the catastrophic shear. To fire the counterpulse too early would be useless, too late, and it would only add to the destruction. It had to be perfect. The countdown timer ticked past 1 minute. The groaning of the mountain intensified, a sound of tectonic plates being rent asunder. A large section of the ceiling collapsed at the far end of the command deck, showering the area in debris. No one moved. All eyes were on Alara. 30 seconds, she announced, her voice steady. Her right hand hovered over the pulse button. Her gaze was locked on the rising curve of the enemy wave. It was beautiful, in a terrifying mathematical way. A perfect weapon. 15 seconds. The vibrations were so intense now that the deck plates were visibly shuddering. It felt like being inside a giant bell that was about to be struck. 10. Her finger lowered, resting on the surface of the button. She could feel the hum of the unlocked reactor through the console, a wild, terrible power straining to be unleashed. 5, 4, 3, 2. The enemy waveform reached its crescendo, a perfect, terrible peak. For a single infinitesimal moment, it hung there, pregnant with the destruction of a mountain. Now, she pressed the button. There was no sound. There was only light and pressure. For 3.2 seconds, the full, unshielded power of a fusion reactor was shunted through the geological survey emitters. The lights in the station did not just go out. They were extinguished, their filaments instantly vaporized. The emergency lighting died. The entire station was plunged into absolute, terrifying blackness. A wave of pressure slammed through the command deck, so intense it felt like being submerged in the deepest ocean. It was a physical manifestation of the counter-resonance, a precisely shaped wave of pure force fired down into the heart of the mountain. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The pressure vanished. The gut-wrenching hum of the enemy's attack ceased. The violent shuddering of the mountains stopped. Silence. A true silence this time. An absolute absence of noise. The groaning of the rock was gone. The shriek of the dying network was gone. The hum of the life support was gone. There was only the sound of a few dozen people breathing raggedly in the pitch-black, dust-filled darkness. It was the most profound, most beautiful silence anyone had ever heard. It was the sound of survival. A full minute passed in that silent, black void. Then, with a flicker and a hum, the station's backup battery systems kicked in. The red emergency lights sputtered back to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the debris-strewn command deck. The scene they illuminated was one of devastation. Collapsed ceiling panels, cracked walls, shattered consoles. But it was not a tomb. It was a wreck. They were alive. Alara's face was illuminated by the faint glow of her own console's emergency power. Her system, designed for this exact contingency, had rebooted. On her main screen, the seismic display showed a chaotic jumble of feedback from the vaporized emitters, but beneath it, the deep strata were silent. The resonant frequency was gone. The lattice of microfractures was inert. She had done it. She had threaded the needle. She had met a symphony of destruction with a single, perfect, discordant note, and shattered it. The threat was neutralized. Lieutenant Rostova was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion. "Status?" she asked, her question directed not at the empty space where the commander used to be the center of the universe, but at Alara. "The external resonance has been neutralized," Alara reported, her voice as calm as ever, though a thin sheen of sweat coated her brow. "The emitters are gone, and the primary reactor is offline, but stable. The cascade was halted before it could trigger a structural shear. The mountain will hold," she ran a quick diagnostic. "The phalanx network that was controlling the emitters has gone dark. The feedback loop from our pulse likely fried their command and control hardware. They are blind and deaf." A ragged cheer went up from the assembled Marines. It was a weak, exhausted sound, but it was a sound of victory. They looked at Alara, at her small, unassuming form, with a new and profound sense of awe. She had not just saved their lives, she had done the impossible. She had fought a mountain and won. Commander Valerius was on his knees. The pressure wave had knocked him off his feet. He stared at the cracked floor plates, his mind a maelstrom of shattered certainties. Everything he had believed in, protocol, rank, the simple logic of force, had been rendered meaningless. He had been a spectator to his own salvation, a salvation delivered by the very person he had sought to humiliate and destroy. The shame was a physical weight, crushing him more completely than any amount of rock could have. He had not just been proven wrong, he had been proven irrelevant. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. He looked at Alara, who who was already running diagnostics on the station's crippled network, her work not yet done. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? Thank you? I'm sorry? The words were inadequate, obscene in the face of what had just happened. He was a relic, and he knew it. It was at that moment that a single speaker, one of the few on the command deck that had survived, crackled to life. It was a priority channel, a direct link to high command, one that used a hardened quantum-encrypted satellite link that had weathered the storm. A voice, calm, aged, and radiating an authority that dwarfed anything Valerius had ever possessed, filled the silent room. Deep Watch Kestrel, this is Admiral Thrace. Report your status. We registered a massive, directed energy event, followed by total signal loss. Admiral Thrace. The name fell into the room like a hammer blow. Marcus Thrace, commander of the Coalition's Special Operations and Intelligence Directorate, a living legend. Valerius felt a fresh wave of cold dread. Thrace was a name whispered in the highest echelons of power, a man who operated in the deepest shadows. For him to be monitoring this station personally meant that its importance was far greater than Valerius had ever been told. Before Valerius could even formulate a response, Rostova, acting on pure instinct, held a comms handset out to Alara. "It's for you," she said, her voice full of a certainty that bordered on reverence. Alara took the handset. She did not seem surprised. "Admiral," she said, her voice clear and steady. "This is Echo. The Phalanx deployed a sub-resonance weapon. We have neutralized the threat. The station is crippled, but structurally sound. No casualties." There was a pause on the other end. Then Thrace's voice came back, a hint of warmth in its gravelly depths. "Echo, I should have known they would send you. Good work. I assume you encountered some local resistance to your methods?" The question was pointed, and everyone in the room knew exactly who it was aimed at. Valerius felt the Admiral's unseen gaze lock onto him across 1,000 miles. He was being judged, and he had already been found wanting. Ilara's response was characteristically direct. The station commander's operational paradigm was not suited to the nature of the threat. His interference was a liability. "I see," Thrace said. The two words were a death sentence for Valerius's career. "Put him on." Alara held the handset out to Valerius. Her eyes were blank, her expression unreadable. He took it, his hand trembling. He lifted it to his ear. "Commander Valerius here, sir." Thrace's voice was no longer warm. It was as cold and as hard as the granite heart of the mountain. "Commander, you had one of my best assets under your command, an asset whose operational file is so highly classified that you do not have the clearance to even read its cover page. You were given a simple directive: facilitate her work. Instead, you obstructed her. You belittled her. You attempted to reassign her to sanitation duties less than an hour before she single-handedly saved you and every soul on that station from a threat you were too blind and too arrogant to even comprehend. Have I summarized the situation accurately?" Valerius's throat was dry. He could not speak. "Sir," he croaked. "She is not just an analyst, Commander," Thrace continued, his voice a whip crack over the comm. "Her operational call sign is Red Venom. She is the lead strategist for Project Chimera. She does not analyze threats. She dismantles them. She has stabilized regimes and collapsed insurgencies from halfway around the world by manipulating the very ground they stand on. You had a scalpel that could perform miracles, and you tried to use it as a hammer. You are a disgrace to your uniform." Red Venom, the name echoed in the silent command center. The Marines stared at Alara, their awe turning into something closer to fear. The quiet geologist, the civilian contractor. She was a ghost, a legend from the blackest of Black Ops projects. Valerius, his face a mask of utter devastation, looked at Alara. The full, crushing weight of his failure crashed down upon him. He had not just been wrong. He had been spectacularly, historically, career-endingly wrong. In a final desperate act of defiance against the reality that was erasing him, he found his voice. It was a pathetic, broken thing. Who are you?" he stammered, looking at Alara, not the handset. Alara took the handset back from his nerveless fingers. A sound escaped her lips. It was not a laugh of joy or humor. It was a dry, cold, mirthless exhalation of air, the sound of a closing crypt. It was the most terrifying sound Valerius had ever heard. "Ask the Admiral who I am," she said, her voice a blade of ice. Then she turned her back on him and spoke into the comms. "Admiral, Commander Valerius is compromised. He is emotionally and professionally unfit for command. I am formally assuming operational control of this station until a replacement arrives." "Acknowledged, Red Venom," Thrace's voice replied without hesitation. "Control is yours. A relief crew and a formal inquiry team will be there in 48 hours. Keep the asset secure. Thrace out." The speaker clicked into silence. Alara placed the handset back in its cradle. She did not look at Valerius again. He was no longer a factor. He was a piece of broken equipment to be cleared away with the rest of the debris. He stumbled backwards, his face slack with shock, and collapsed into a nearby chair, a man utterly broken. The Marines watched him, then looked back at Alara, their new commander. In the 48 hours that followed, a new order established itself in the battered shell of Deepwatch Station Kestrel. It was a quiet, efficient order, dictated not by rank, but by necessity. Alara, or Red Venom, as the crew now whispered among themselves, was the undisputed center of this new reality. She did not raise her voice. She did not issue grand pronouncements. She gave quiet, logical instructions, and they were followed without question. She organized teams to clear debris, to triage the damaged systems, to jury-rig communications, and to begin the long process of bringing the station's core functions back online. She showed no pleasure in her newfound authority, no triumph in Valerius's fall. Her victory was not personal. It was a mathematical proof, a successful experiment. The man himself was merely a variable that had been rendered null. He remained confined to his quarters, a ghost haunting the periphery of the new world he no longer had a place in. The Marines, who had once mocked her, now moved with a quiet reverence when she was near. They brought her nutrient packs without being asked. They made sure her water flask was always full. They treated her not as a commander to be feared, but as a force of nature to be respected. Lieutenant Rostova became her de facto second-in-command. She translated Alara's technical directives into practical orders for the crew, her face a mask of fierce loyalty. On the second day, as Alara was deep in the process of rewriting the station's corrupted network protocols from scratch, Rostova approached her alcove. She did not speak for a long moment, simply watching the cascade of code on the screen. Finally, she slid a small gray object onto the edge of the console. It was a rock, a piece of the F7 stratum granite, blasted loose during the counterpulse. It was crystalline and sharp, its fractured surface glittering in the dim light. "I was on one of the survey teams," Rostova said quietly. "I found this near the Foundation. I was wondering, the lattice you found, the enemy's work, How did you know how to break it? Alara paused her work. She picked up the rock, turning it over in her pale fingers. She felt its weight, its texture, the sharp edges of its fracture. Every system has a resonant frequency, she said, her gaze distant. A frequency that gives it strength and cohesion. But every resonant frequency also has a dissonant counterpart, a note that it cannot tolerate. The enemy built a perfectly tuned structure. They sang it a song to make it strong. I just had to find the one note that would make it fall apart. She looked at Rostova, her eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been a shared understanding. They assumed their system was perfect. No system is perfect. Every strength has a corresponding weakness. You just have to know where to listen. Rostova nodded slowly, the immensity of the concept settling over her. Alara wasn't just a soldier or a scientist. She was something else entirely. She was a reader of systems, a finder of hidden flaws. She looked at the rock in Alara's hand, then at the woman herself. "Thank you," she said. The words were for more than just saving their lives. They were for the lesson. When the relief team arrived, led by a grim-faced colonel who treated Alara with a mixture of awe and formal deference, she simply handed him a data slate. It contained a full report of the incident, a diagnostic of the station's remaining capabilities, and a detailed plan for its reconstruction. Her work was done. While the new command team was busy assessing the damage and the old crew was being debriefed, she disappeared. There was no formal departure, no farewell. One moment she was in her alcove, running a final diagnostic. The next, she was gone, having boarded the same transport that brought the relief crew, leaving as quietly as she had arrived. She left behind a station saved from ruin and a crew forever changed. She left behind the wreckage of a commander's career and the birth of a legend whispered in the deep, dark places of the world. The story of Deepwatch Kestrel became a cautionary tale in the high echelons of the coalition, a lesson in the folly of arrogance and the quiet, devastating power of true competence. They spoke of the quiet woman who listened to mountains, the analyst who broke an army with a single, perfectly timed pulse of energy. They spoke of red venom. And so, the ghost departed, leaving not a memory of what was, but a blueprint for what must be. She did not seek recognition or glory. These were variables that did not factor into her equations. Her purpose was the integrity of the system, the elegant solution to the intractable problem. She moved on to the next crisis, the next mountain that needed listening to, the next arrogant man who believed the world still operated on his simple, outdated rules. She was a force of logic in a world of chaos, a whisper of truth in a chorus of noise. Her legacy not written in medals or commendations, but in the silent, stable foundations of the world she repeatedly and quietly saved.